Hi everybody, this is Ambarish Fadnavis. We are speaking on Atharva Forum and we are in conversation with Mr. Anish Gokhale, who has written multitude of books on Maratha history. His first book was on the dash of Raghunath Rao Peshwa on Atak and Peshawar. The latest one being canvassing various important landmark battles which shaped the history of Maratha Empire and India and Hindus in the Indian subcontinent in the 17th and 18th century. So, the stated aim of Maratha Empire, or as it's better known, Hindavi Swarajya, was always to A, establish or re-establish Dharma on the land of India, and B, liberate all the holy lands and holy rivers from the dominion of what we called, or what our ancestors called, outsiders, barbarians. Uh, Basically, it meant liberation of India from Islamic and colonial European domination. All the efforts which our ancestors put towards achieving this particular goal were started by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. We call him the Swarajya Samsthapak, the establisher of Hindavi Swarajya. The quintessential part of having the dharma, establishing dharma, is to know what it entails to establish a dharma. The most important landmark in this entire journey is the coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, which happened in 1674. This particular this particular event, this particular event is a shift, is a Overton window shift in Indian history of last 1,000 years prior to this particular event, because for the first time a Hindu king was being coronated the way Vikramaditya was coronated, the way Sri Ram or Yudhishthir was coronated. The particular vidhi is called Aindra Abhisheka. It essentially proclaimed that Kali Yuga has ended on this earth and the dominion of Asuras, the way Hindus typically call the tyrannical rulers, Asuras and Rakshasas. The rule of Rakshasas is over, and dharmic people can walk and live on this good earth peacefully, because there is a king who is an incarnation of Sri Vishnu, has established his kingdom on earth. So this particular event, which happened on Raigad in 1674, has a long-lasting impact on the the very ethos of Hindu Dharma in India. And this particular institution, which Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj created, the throne of Hindu, is not a one of it. It has a long history prior to that particular event, and it sustained many rigors of time, many invasions which almost came to abolishing it. Yet it survived and thrived and bounced back many times while liberating this entire subcontinent, which we call our sacred geography or holy land, from Islamic domination. So, what we are going to do in the course of this conversation with Shri Anish is to deal with few landmark points, which in which we moved sort of to a higher trajectory in this particular movement of establishment of dharma in in Indian subcontinent. So I welcome Shri Anish ji to speak about his book, and through his book we will see how dharma was established through lens of various important landmark events, mostly battles. Please, Anish ji, what do you think was the first real test for Hindavi Swarajya's existence?
Right. So, first of all, thank you to Atharva Forum for the invitation, and many thanks to Ambarish for this very kind introduction. And as you have mentioned, the coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji was a landmark event in the history of the country. So, first I'll dwell a bit on this as to why was it landmark, why was it different from any other coronation, and how it marked a departure from the prevalent system that was mainly the Mughal system of North India and the Islamic systems of the Deccani Sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. So, at that point of time, all the laws that were made according to the Islamic jurisprudence, which was based on the Quran and the Hadith. So, leave apart a few, Deshmukhs or Patils who would be giving laws in their own villages or own fiefdoms. The main law-giving body was of Islamic nature, and that was the Mughal Darbar or the Darbar of Bijapur or Golconda in South India. So now, when Chhatrapati Shivaji managed to liberate so much of Maharashtra from the Mughals and from Adil Shahi, that is, he actually liberated a part expanding from around Nashik, Aurangabad region all the way to Kolhapur, and he had thousands of soldiers working under him, and he had ministers who would be at his beck and call. But at this point of coronation was needed to make him the right and legal ruler over the people. That is why, because it is not just that he has to be a Kshatriya or he has to win battles to be able to give laws according to the Hindu government, Hindu scriptures. What the Hindu scriptures demanded was that the Raja has to be an Abhishekta Raja, is that he has to perform a coronation according to the scriptures, which involve various ceremonies, which I'll come to a bit later. And after doing these ceremonies, would he then be considered at a level higher than the Brahmins and all the other populace? Because this was necessary for him to be shown above the entire population, because he was going to give laws and make decisions for the entire country, and which is why a coronation ceremony took place. Like I mentioned, he was representative of the Lord Vishnu. In fact, Chhatrapati Shivaji carried an idol, a gold idol of Sri Vishnu during his coronation. The water of all the holy rivers was poured on his head during the ceremony. There was a masnad which was created in the name of Indra. So, creating this masnad or the throne in the name of Indra, what it signified was that just like Indra was the king of the Devtas, Chhatrapati Shivaji was also now going to be king of the entire population. Then there was an Abhishek carried out of Chhatrapati Shivaji. Like they similarly carry out Abhishek of gods at your house. An Abhishek of Chhatrapati Shivaji was carried out to proclaim him as the Chhatrapati of the entire population. Then at this point he could then start giving out laws, and his jurisprudence was Hindu in nature. He actually uh, appointed a post known as Panditra, who is to give laws according to the Arthashastra and according to Shukra Niti of Hindu scriptures. And this actually marked a very wide and correct departure from the Islamic jurisprudence in prevalence, because otherwise there was no link to go to. Otherwise, it would have just been a continuation of what was going on with the Hindu head at the end. But Chhatrapati Shivaji ensured that through his coronation, that he was now going to chart a different journey with the basis of Hindu scriptures on the bedrock of the Arthashastra and other ancient texts, and really mark a departure from the 400-500 years of slavery that was going on in the country. And in the course of reaching here, of course, the journey was not easy. The first battle, which was uh, really testing Chhatrapati Shivaji, really tested Chhatrapati Shivaji, was the one against Afzal Khan, that is the Battle of Pratapgarh. So it was in the Battle of Pratapgarh that Chhatrapati Shivaji was really tested by the Bijapur Sultan, that is Adil Shah. He sent his most proficient general, his most efficient army to tackle Shivaji, who was at the point of time only 29 years old. And so it was quite a contest, and it was a point where Chhatrapati Shivaji could have lost his life and Swarajya could have come to an end. So yes, we can start with first battle that is most important for Hindu Swarajya was the Battle of Pratapgarh.
So there were many battles before Pratapgarh also, but Pratapgarh is where he really, it was make or break event for Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. We can say ki if we use some Sanskrit terms, the real Bhagyodaya of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj happened at that foot of that particular fort, when he managed to surprise not only Adil Shah but almost entire world. I guess even Brits and Portuguese, French and Hollandians, they too took notice of whatever happened in that particular battle, which was so, and the outcome was so, how do you say, nobody could have predicted that particular outcome which happened. It was a black swan event of that particular time. So how did it unfold?
Right. So, as I mentioned, at that point of time, Chhatrapati Shivaji had not really been tested on the battlefield. There had been battles before it, but they had been against lesser generals of Adil Shah. And Chhatrapati Shivaji, had in fact, taken advantage of a feud of an argument that was going on between the Mughals and Bijapur at that point of time in the 1650s, in which, of course, Adil Shah was busy warning off a Mughal invasion led by Aurangzeb from his territories in the Karnataka. And this time window, Chhatrapati Shivaji used quite well to expand his own influence over various forts in the Sahyadri, such as Torna and Rajgarh, other places. So Adil Shah of Bijapur finally found out that he has to do something about this, and he sent Afzal Khan, who was like I mentioned, a seasoned general of his army. He had won many battles in South India, and he was in fact considered to be responsible for the killing of Sambhaji, that is Chhatrapati Shivaji's elder brother, during the siege of Kanakgiri. Now you must understand this point of time, Chhatrapati Shivaji did not have really anything with him apart from a few forts, and he only had a small ideal called Swarajya to appeal to his people, that I am going to provide you with Swarajya, that is Hindavi Swarajya, it is going to be our rule, our self rule. And on the opposite end, but this Swarajya did not really entail as to what gain was going to be there for the people. It had a very uh, a presence that was above monetary or land gains or material gains. On the other hand, Afzal Khan had come with a big army from Bijapur, and he had started giving off letters of both threatening letters as well as letters of support to all the various Jagirdars and Watandars in Maharashtra. So what the effect had was that Afzal Khan was basically telling them either you join me or otherwise once I finish Chhatrapati Shivaji, I'll come after you. And at that point of time, Chhatrapati Shivaji was a 29-year-old who did not have anything with him apart from a small army and an ideal of Swarajya. So the odds were totally stacked against him. And in fact, quite a number of Chhatrapati Shivaji was in Maharashtra. Quite a lot of Jagirdars and Watandars of the Sahyadris, in fact, went over to Afzal Khan. But at this point of time, a person called a Sardar called Kanoji Jedhe came to Chhatrapati Shivaji at Rajgarh, and he said that I'm not going over to Afzal Khan. I totally believe in this ideal of Swarajya, Hindavi Swarajya that you have espoused, and I might as well relinquish my Watan, my Jagir to you, rather than go over to the Bijapur army. And this,
I guess Kanuji Jadhe was also a friend of his father, Shahaji Raje, who that influence particularly played out quite a lot.
it's true. So Kanoji Jedhe actually was a very experienced Sardar, and he had, before this he was a friend of Shahaji Raje. And Shahaji Raje, in fact, had sent him along with Shivaji to the Deccan, and he was supposed to watch over Chhatrapati Shivaji. But this was a very crucial decision as to whether he was going to support Chhatrapati Shivaji in this most trying hour, or he was going to consider a more practical exit route. So it is to the benefit of Hindavi Swarajya that Kanoji Jedhe took this decision, because a very experienced and senior person like him had decided that Hindavi Swarajya was worth putting money on, was worth something worth dying for, and as a result, immediately all the defections to Afzal Khan stopped. And the first problem, that is of having your own people turn against you and causing a defeat, was thus averted. Apart from this, Afzal Khan started from Bijapur and he crossed Turzapur near Solapur. So this Turzapur Bhavani temple was harmed by him, was attacked by him. He also attacked other temples on the way, that is Ravanath. He also sent soldiers to attack the Kolhapur temple. So a lot of temple destruction or harming the idols or looting the temples was carried out on his route from Bijapur towards Rajgarh. And what he did was that from Pandharpur, where again it is on desecration of temple. From Pandharpur, he sent three generals, that is Kate, Pandre, and Siddhi Hilal, towards the Pune district, that is today's Pune district and Supe Shirwa areas. His aim was that he will send 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers into Pune. Chhatrapati Shivaji at the time was at Rajgarh, which is about 30 miles from Pune city. So Afzal Khan's aim was to draw Chhatrapati Shivaji out of those mountains and make him fight on the plain areas that is existing from Pune city towards Baramati. A large plain area is there. To make Chhatrapati Shivaji fight on this plain area where Afzal Khan could employ his cavalry and his artillery and decimate him. So these people started looting all these areas, but Chhatrapati Shivaji, very clever, he did not fall for this trap. And in spite of seeing his entire Pune being up in flames, he remained at Rajgarh. In fact, his own cavalry chief, Netoji Palkar, who came to him two or three times during this time period, and he said that I have troops with me, let me go and evict these 4,000 people. But then Chhatrapati Shivaji's cunningness also comes here. He says that let them do whatever they want here. I want to make Afzal Khan feel that he is very powerful and that I am very weak. If I try and drive his soldiers out, that won't serve the purpose. So let them loot this area, let them burn this area. It will cause a leniency on the part of Afzal Khan. And the end result was that Afzal Khan reached Vai near Satara, but Chhatrapati Shivaji remained at Rajgarh, and it was a sort of stalemate that existed throughout April and May of 1659.
I guess this was a similar strategy which all his subsequent successors also employed. I mean, I remember Bajirao allowing Pune to be burnt, or Madharao allowing. It's the objective was more important than the damage
True.
to the real estate. It is
Yeah.
very departure from the classical Hindu response which had been there since until that point of time.
True. Yes. So Pune basically never designed as a place to be guarded or fought. It was a city, obviously, but the whole planning right from the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji is that the nearby forts of Purandar, Simhagad, Rajgarh, Torna, they will provide the fighting and they will provide the soldiers, but the city itself is not something to be guarded till everybody died, because guarding the city and fighting the city obviously entailed trying to defend a large open plain area which the Marathas did not have the capabilities or did not have the tactics to defend until very late in the 18th century. So even for a place like Pune, the strategy was to leave it as it is. It was never a very well developed or large city till it came to 1790s. Up to that point, it always remained a small place. And the tactic was to retreat into the hills and try and fight from the hills. So Afzal Khan's first bet that he would draw Chhatrapati Shivaji out of the hill forts of Rajgarh and make him fight on the plains and kill him or defeat him and take him to Bijapur had failed. So this is all happening in April and May of 1659. So again, first question which you asked is why is Afzal Khan trying all this in the sweltering heat of May and April? Something interesting had happened in North India at the same time. There was a succession struggle going on in Delhi. Aurangzeb was fighting against his three brothers and also his father, and the entire landscape of North India was aflame with battles and fights everywhere. The problem for Adil Shah was that if this contest of North India ended in Aurangzeb's favor, first thing he would do is come down to Deccan, because Aurangzeb, right from the time he was first made Subedar at Aurangabad in 1636, he had made it amply clear that he is going to attack South India and annex the two Deccani Sultanates. So both Bijapur and Golconda were looking northwards at Delhi as to what is going to happen over there. And he did not want a situation where Aurangzeb is settled on the Delhi throne and then he starts his campaign against Chhatrapati Shivaji. So he started his campaign in April, thinking that by May it would be done. But as it turned out, June first week, June second week had come, the monsoon had started, and Chhatrapati Shivaji was still at Rajgarh. Nothing had happened apart from a few places getting burnt. Very interestingly, Aurangzeb had got crowned in Delhi as the new Mughal emperor, and he sent a khillat, A khillat is a royal robe. It's a robe of honor. A robe of honor was sent in the hands of one Shaista Khan towards, you must be guessing, towards Adil Shah of Bijapur, but no, he sent it towards Chhatrapati Shivaji. So Aurangzeb had sent a khillat, that is robe of honor, in the hands of Shaista Khan for Chhatrapati Shivaji. And now this obviously created a funny situation because neither of them wanted this robe to come south and start mingling with the affairs of the Deccan. Neither Chhatrapati Shivaji nor Afzal Khan. So now it would take about 6 or 8 months for that Shaista Khan to reach, maybe more, or 8 months for Shaista Khan to reach from Delhi to the Deccan. Now Chhatrapati Shivaji had to settle this issue before those 8 months got over. As a result, what he did was that he moved from Rajgarh towards Pratapgarh, that is near Satara, in July, in the monsoons of 1659. He moved from there. Now Pratapgarh, as if you have to point out one campaign which has really reflected all the qualities of Chhatrapati Shivaji, it is this one. Because at Pratapgarh, what it did was that it was a new fort, and this new fort created new hurdles for Afzal Khan. And from July onwards, up to November of that year, there could not be any movement of the troops because the ground was all slushy and all muddy, and nothing could happen for next 3-4 months. Then finally, a meeting was fixed in November 1659, and Afzal Khan was to come up a road built by Chhatrapati Shivaji up a place called Ratondi Ghat, and he was to meet Chhatrapati Shivaji. Afzal Khan had put all his troops around Pratapgarh, but Shivaji had also put all his troops around Pratapgarh. In fact, Chhatrapati Shivaji had marked out just about every soldier of his enemy, and the entire fort was surrounded by the troops of Afzal Khan and Chhatrapati Shivaji. And what he did was that once this Afzal Khan had come to his tent, he built a shamiana at the base of Pratapgarh, where he was called for a meeting because Afzal Khan decided that he's going to have a negotiation with Chhatrapati Shivaji. And as far as his past track record was concerned, he had initially also called a person called the Raja of Ikkeri for a conversation and had him killed. So he had a track record of killing people by calling them for meetings. So Chhatrapati Shivaji was wary of this. That is why he was wearing a chilkhat and a metal helmet under his jireto. This road was built by Chhatrapati Shivaji up Ratondi Ghat to the base of Pratapgarh. He ensured that the bodyguards of the two were placed at a distance of 1 arrow shot. Now, why 1 arrow shot? So that prevents somebody from shooting an arrow and killing the other person. Then he ensured only one bodyguard to be inside the tent with either of them. Which is why we have Jiva Mala with Chhatrapati Shivaji and Sayyid Banda with Afzal Khan. Then he ensured that each and every path guarded. He had put Netoji Palkar on what is the Panchgani plateau today, and the Panchgani plateau were full of Netoji Palkar's cavalry. So as soon as Chhatrapati Shivaji killed Afzal Khan, immediately guns were sounded on the forts, and all these soldiers who had been lying around in the ravines and defiles near Pratapgarh immediately fell upon Afzal Khan's army and completely decimated it.
Yeah, it's a dream of every general. Double envelopment from
True.
both sides.
True. So it was a very correct and tactical arrangement of troops. In fact, Captain Modak has written in one of his books that it was so accurate, the arrangement of the troops, that in a place where you found that Afzal Khan's soldiers were placed, he will not place the cavalry next to it. He will not put infantry and cavalry together. Because Chhatrapati Shivaji was thinking that if the horses are put next to infantry soldiers, the horses could make noises, they could start stomping their feet, they could react to something, and probably give away the locations of Chhatrapati Shivaji's troops. So this was the level of thinking going on at that point of time. And we were always thinking beyond of this, and he was also very clear about who to place at what point near Pratapgarh. Kanoji Jedhe was placed near the Hapshi troops near the tent who were going to attack Chhatrapati Shivaji the moment Afzal Khan attacked him. So the most experienced person was placed to deal with them. Then we have Moropant Pingre, who had played a part in the building of Pratapgarh. So even though Moropant Pingre was an excellent cavalry soldier, Chhatrapati Shivaji ensured that he was there in the ravines near Pratapgarh because he knew the geographical layout of that area absolutely 100%. So by following these tactics, you find that Chhatrapati Shivaji's strategic sense was very good. Now beyond this, a very good book called Pratapgarh Campaign by Major Joshi, in which he has detailed as to how after killing Afzal Khan, he talks about how Chhatrapati Shivaji made his advantage not only 100% but 200% by going after Afzal Khan's army once he had been defeated. So this is something that is very rare to find among Hindu kings throughout history. Even if there are victories we find, like Professor Purankar says in one of his essays, that Hindu victories usually mean a status quo when they win and complete destruction when they lose. So even today, after in case of Pakistan also, till the time this surgical strike took place, it was basically Pakistan attacking and then we tried to defend at the LOC and then again Pakistan attacked. Similarly, in the past also, invasion used to happen and defense usually meant trying to guard your borders and throw the enemy across the border. Then again, second time again invasion used to happen. What Chhatrapati Shivaji did was at this juncture, he invaded Adil Shah's Bijapur territory. And from that point in November 1659, for the next 1 year, he managed to capture areas all the way to Kolhapur. And while the Adil Shah of Bijapur wanted to kill Chhatrapati Shivaji, the end result was that Afzal Khan had been killed and he had lost territories equal to the whole of the district of Satara and Kolhapur. In fact, Chhatrapati Shivaji had doubled his own Swarajya in the aftermath of this attack. Then again he came back to Pune and he cut off Shaista Khan's fingers also, which was a follow-up
So
of this event.
to give the analogy of a satellite launch, when we launched Mangalyaan, we used Earth's gravity to increase our orbits. Thus, the firing, wherein the projectile moves to a higher orbit, those particular junctions. This is the first real shooting of the boosters, which threw the empire into a higher orbit towards glory. So, in due course, when the next point is coming for the second shot, which we are going to talk about, what happened in between is Mughal Maratha war started, right? Mirza Raja came, defeat, Shivaji Raja surrendered, went to Agra, came back. They are all legend themselves. Chhatrapati ended with this particular point. And after 6 months, 6 years or so, I think Chhatrapati Shivaji passed away in April. And
Right.
the reigns of Hindavi Swarajya went to his eldest son, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, Shambhu Maharaj, as we call it in Maharashtra with love. So Shambhu Maharaj's reign lasted for about 9 years, and the landmark of it is Aurangzeb himself invaded the Deccan. Right? I mean, so far he has been sending generals after generals, but now in 1681, I think 6-7 months after the death of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Aurangzeb himself descends on to Deccan to conquer entire India. And for first 9 years, Chhatrapati Shambhu Maharaj fought valiantly, but he was treacherously arrested and murdered and tortured. It's a horrible page of history, of Hindu history. But how did Marathas go about in that crucial hour when they were so close to being annihilated? And with them, all the hope of Hindu resurgence, of Hindu survival in India.
Right. So I'll take you back to three events which took place before Chhatrapati Shivaji. Okay. So one is the Battle of Talikota, which is 1565. One is the second Battle of Panipat, 1556. And the third event is the fall of the Devgiri Yadavs, which is about 1298 AD. So these three events happened before Chhatrapati Shivaji. And the reason I mention them is that Talikota marked the end of the Vijayanagar Empire, which was the first example of Hindu resurgence in South India, and they had built an empire that stretched all across the south. In fact, this was then completely shattered in one battle at Talikota. And the Battle of Panipat marked, of course, the death of Hemu, who had crowned himself the king at Delhi in the years prior to Panipat.
Yes. I think he was Hemu Vikramaditya, no?
Hemchandra Vikramaditya is his correct appellation.
Fascinating.
He had marked himself as Vikramaditya, crowned himself at Delhi, and then he died due to an arrow shot at Panipat. And the third event was at Aurangabad, at the Daulatabad fort, also called the Devgiri fort, in which Alauddin Khilji laid siege to the place. And he laid siege to that place and managed to capture it. So what had happened was that there was too much dependence on individual prowess and individual brilliance in all these three cases. Plus, the strategizing was bad on the part of the Devgiri Yadavs, especially, also on the part of Hemchandra. And all three cases, the absence of an higher ideal of like Swarajya or Hindu Swarajya was really what mattered, because once that leader had been killed, everybody completely dispersed. There was no ideal left to fight for. It was all hinging on the personality of a single person. In fact, at Talikota, when Ramaraya got killed, the opponent kingdoms, these Dakhani sultanates, they beheaded and put his head on display, and this was sufficient to cause a complete disarray in the troops.
If I remember correctly, they put Ram Raya's head on mouth of a gutter.
Yes.
So that all the dirty water will come from his mouth. It was such a humiliating thing for a Hindu, just to prove a point.
So a similar event had been carried out in Maharashtra on the death of Chhatrapati Sambhaji, and Aurangzeb believed that this would actually cause a complete demoralization of the troops. Because let's remember, he had not only killed Chhatrapati Sambhaji, but 2 years prior to that, he had managed to get rid of first the Golconda Sultanate and second the Bijapur Sultanate. So both these Muslim sultanates, Muslim Dakkani kingdoms, Aurangzeb had put an end to, and either had killed their incumbents or put them in prison where they died. So at that point of time, where everybody in South India had got defeated, and Chhatrapati Sambhaji's head was paraded through the various towns and forts of Maharashtra, it was a way of Aurangzeb saying that I am the most powerful here, so now come and bow down to me. But of course, the Marathas, instead of getting demoralized, were inspired by this act because his martyrdom could not go waste. He had fought close to 70 to 80 battles in the course of his career. Usually, we don't associate Chhatrapati Sambhaji with fighting too many battles. So we don't usually associate Chhatrapati Sambhaji fighting too many battles. But the fact is that he had fought about 70 to 80 of them, and his death, in fact, was an inspiration. So now the problem was that all the problems which had faced the kingdoms of Hemchandra Vikramaditya and had faced the Ramaraya kingdom, Vijayanagar kingdom, and the Devgiri Yadavs were staring at the Marathas. They did not have their leader. Chhatrapati Sambhaji had died. Their capital city was completely surrounded from all sides. Their new Chhatrapati was just 20 years old, Chhatrapati Rajaram, who was taken out of house arrest and put on the throne. And everywhere you could see it was just Mughals winning this war and that war and capturing all the forts. So it was a point where Hindavi Swarajya as a concept became very important, because Chhatrapati Rajaram needed some kind of a rallying point for his people. Apart from just the death of Chhatrapati Sambhaji, that they had to be fighting for a Hindavi Swarajya, that they were fighting for an ideal for which already hundreds of people had died. And at this point, to give up this ideal, to give up Hindavi Swarajya was incorrect. And hence, fired by this ideal, then the Marathas fought for further 17 years. 7 of them were led by Maharani Tarabai. And in these 17 years, we find 4 people especially coming to prominence. One was Santaji Khorpade, other was Dhanaji Jadhav, then the Ramchandra Panta, and there was Shankaraji Pant Sachiv. So these 4 people really managed the Maratha War of Independence between them very well. and over 100 or 150 skirmishes were fought between the Mughals and the Marathas throughout this war. In fact, there are a couple of utterances of Chhatrapati Rajaram during the war which really bring out his character towards Maharashtra Dharma or towards Kshatriya Dharma. Now, this is a war going on, obviously, and the Marathas have to spend a lot of money out of their already depleting coffers. But Chhatrapati Rajaram finds out that temple wealth has been taken by some of his soldiers to pay for some war expenses happening somewhere. He sends a letter to Ramchandra Panta that this is the first time it has happened, and I want to ensure that this is the last time it is happening. Temple wealth should remain with the temple. It is for the betterment of the people of the village, people of the town, betterment of some other temple, because there are large communities living off the temple funds. And we can always fight a war and win money from elsewhere. So please do not touch the wealth kept in temples for this purpose. Secondly, we find a letter in 1692. This is 1692, 2 years after Chhatrapati Sambhaji has died. Mughals are all over the Deccan. There doesn't seem a possibility of the Marathas winning also, leave alone do anything next after that. At this point of time, 1692, Chhatrapati Rajaram writes a letter to one Hambir Rao and Krishna Rao Ghorpade, where he mentions clearly the words Maharashtra Dharma. And in this case, Maharashtra Dharma doesn't pertain to just the current modern day state of Maharashtra, but it's actually more a term like Rashtra Dharma or even Kshatriya Dharma as to what is our duty as rulers of this land. And Chhatrapati Rajaram uses this word Maharashtra Dharma in his letter of 1692, and he says that we are going to fight the Mughals, we are going to win this war, and he marks out amounts of money to be paid to the Sardars on winning Aurangabad, on winning Hyderabad, on winning Raigad, and on winning Delhi. So these four places at a time when the Mughals are completely inside the Deccan, he was talking of freeing these places from Mughal rule. He's talking about freeing Delhi from Mughal rule in 1692. That early. You can understand his letter coming in 1700s when the Mughals were no longer existent in the Deccan. But as early as 1692, he manages to write this letter, and he writes specifically the words Maharashtra Dharma has to be established over Delhi, and for this a payment of so and so is to be given to the Sardars, some amount of 70,000, 80,000 won. So we can see that throughout the Mughal Maratha war, this ideal of Hindutva Swaraj was supreme, and it what really fired them and kept them inspired to go after the Mughal armies for 27 long years, 17 of them without a proper Chhatrapati in place at Raigad.
So I mean, the example, the way of their fighting in itself is fascinating. I mean, the story of how Ramshes was fought,
True.
and how these people just used to fight until the last bow is shot, then sell the fort, let the Mughals repair the fort, and then win it back and fight again. So that shows the cunningness which has been imbibed by all the followers of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. That real estate is, I mean, the land is to be, the terrain has to be used at our advantage. The geography has to be used for our advantage.
Yes, you have mentioned Ramses. So Ramses took up 6 years of invading Mughal army. A fort in Tamil Nadu, to which Chhatrapati Rajaram had to escape, took up 8 years of the Mughal army. So 14 years was spent by some or the other Mughal soldier trying to fight Ramses and Jinji. And a complete guerrilla warfare in place. Like you mentioned, Aurangzeb decided to purchase forts instead of fighting for them. In fact, we have amounts available for us. He gave 2 lakh rupees for Vishalgarh, he gave 50,000 rupees for other fort, and he paid some 70,000 for Rajgarh, approximate amounts. A good example of guerrilla warfare at the time is how Santaji Ghorpade attacked Aurangzeb's own tent at the time, and this was just after Chhatrapati Sambhaji had died. So they had to do something that was inspirational for the Maratha soldiers. And so Santaji Ghorpade attacked Aurangzeb's own camp with 50 of his followers. He managed to enter it. He managed to reach his tent. Unfortunately, at that point of time, Aurangzeb was not inside his tent. He was somewhere else. But Santaji Ghorpade cut down the ropes of his tent, his military cantonment, and there were 2 golden spires on top of those tents to signify it as is a royal tent. He cut off the spires and he went straight to Sivagarh. Now the Mughals are thinking that this guy is going to Sivagarh. Now our problem for the moment is done. He's going to go sit on Sivagarh, and we are okay for now. Okay, one big disaster happened, but beyond that, nothing. But Santaji Ghorpade did not ascend the fort that night. He slept in the village at the base. He rested his whole army. Next morning, he was rested. He went to Raigad, which was besieged by Zulfikar Khan. He attacked Raigad. He killed 1,000 people there also. And then he escaped from Raigad and came to Vishalgarh and presented the golden cones to Chhatrapati Rajaram, saying that this is what I got from Afzal Khan, Aurangzeb's tent. So this is the kind of warfare that was going on throughout those 27 years.
When he was a child. And
Obviously.
I guess he must have seen Dhananjay Yadav. Dhananjay Yadav was his father's good friend.
Yes, quite possibly
So
his
he-
childhood Brazil, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the way Bajirao has moved all throughout peninsular India is very similar to how Santaji was moving all across peninsular India and the forts. So,
True.
so let's come to the next trajectory increase of our satellite. When the era of Bajirao, as we say, when the kingdom became an empire, when Hindavi Swaraj became Hindavi Samraj. And the crowning glory is, of course, Palkhed and Bhopal. So please, you can't miss without these two.
So, like I mentioned, this Maratha War of Independence was over by 1707, the year Aurangzeb died. Aurangzeb tried right up to the end to try and finish this war in his favor. It wasn't happening. So the moment he died, all his soldiers turned around and left for Delhi. So nobody was interested in fighting this war, where they had lost everything the past so many years. And so then we had the rise of Peshwa Bajirao from 1720s onwards. After the Deccan settled and Baji Vishwanath was made a Peshwa, then his son Peshwa Bajirao was made the Peshwa. The first, of course, the Battle of Palkhed, which is more popular, especially made popular by Viscount Montgomery by writing somewhere that it was a masterpiece of strategic ability and cavalry tactics. So, in the Battle of Palkhed, what happened was that the Nizam had attacked Pune and Satara. Bajirao had left, Peshwa Bajirao had left Pune and Satara to its own devices, and he had gone north into the Nizam's territory. Then he had gone into Aurangabad, he went into Washim, then he turned around, he left for Burhanpur. When he left for Burhanpur, Nizam got really alarmed because this was the jewel of the Mughals as far as the Nizam was concerned, the city of Burhanpur. It was the gateway to Deccan, everything else right from the time of Akbar and Jahangir. So now Bajirao going to Burhanpur.
Yeah.
So
The fort of Washington.
Fort of Washirigad. So the Nizam left for chasing Bajirao, but then Bajirao did not go to Burhanpur. He changed his route, went towards Soongad in Gujarat, then he went towards Surat. And now gone towards Surat, the Nizam decided to give up chasing because the Nizam was moving with his guns and artillery and heavy cannons, and Peshwa Bajirao mainly on cavalry. So the speed difference was huge. There was no way that the Nizam was going to be able to catch Peshwa Bajirao. So the Nizam moves to Ahmednagar, and Bajirao finds out that the Nizam intends to cross the river, Godavari river, at a place called Puntamba and blockade Bajirao's path at a place called Palkhed, which is about 30 miles off the place. And Palkhed was a place where you had to cross whether you had were going from Dhule towards Aurangabad or you were going from Dhule towards Ahmednagar. So that was one crossing point which Bajirao would have to reach because the nearest crossing was Puntamba. And Nizam's aim was to trap him there. But what happened was that Bajirao found out about this. He came down a place called Kasri Ghat. He burned the entire village of Palkhed. He poisoned the water sources. He burned the granary. He stationed the soldiers at a place called the Shiv River. And so when the Nizam managed to cross the Puntamba to give battle to Bajirao, we found that Nizam was harassed throughout his route. In fact, a place called Vaijapur on the way was also burned by the Peshwa. This tactic is known as scorched earth, in which to deny the supplies and provisions to an invading army so as to starve them to death, which is what happened to Nizam. He reached Palkhed. There was no food. The Battle of Bhopal happened in 1730 and 1738. So, what essentially that happened was that the Nizam Mulk, the Nizam Asaf Shah, the first had gone to Delhi and he had declared to the Mughal emperor that I am the Subedar of the Malwa and I am going to set the Bajirao in order. So he starts from Delhi, he proceeds towards Kalpi, he crossed Kalpi and reached Bhopal. At the same time, Bajirao came to know about this, crossed the Narmada at a place called Punasa, and then he reached Bhopal in 1737. So the Nizam did not proceed further north, further south to tackle Bajirao somewhere in between. He decided to take the uh, support of the fort at Bhopal. There was a large lake and a nala. In between all this, he put his army, his artillery, and he decided to wait out this invasion of Peshwa Bajirao. Now, what the Nizam was banking on was that he had a very large army, 60, 70,000 soldiers with guns and cannons, and there was no way that Peshwa Bajirao's cavalry was going to be able to win against this artillery in an open field. So Peshwa Bajirao kept his distance from this artillery and harassing Nizam's troops. But with this scenario only, it became a matter of time for the Nizam to win. Because what the Nizam had done was that he had sent message to his son in Aurangabad. His own son came, Nasir Jang, was at Aurangabad, and he sent a message to him saying that you please proceed north and attack this Bajirao from behind. So what will happen is that he will be caught between me and you and not be able to win. So the beauty of this is that Bajirao Peshwa also found out this plan of Nasir Jang being called north. What Bajirao does is that he then suspended Chimaji Appa's campaign in Vasai at this point of time, and he asked Chimaji Appa to station himself at a place called Warangao on the Tapi River, which is north of Aurangabad. Same time, he told Raghuji Bhosle in Nagpur to attack a Mughal Sardar called Shujat Khan at Chalpur. Because Shujat Khan was moving with 25,000 troops towards Aurangabad, and from Aurangabad there were two routes. One was via Warangao on the Tapi, which would head north. One was via Achalpur, which would go again north towards Bhopal. And Peshwa Bajirao, by employing Chimaji Appa and Raghuji Bhosle in this warfare, ensured that both the routes out of Aurangabad were cut off. To understand that the distance between Satara and Bhopal is about 1,000 kilometers. And from Aurangabad to Nagpur around 400 kilometers. So Peshwa Bajirao was strategizing over an area spread approximately say 5,000 or 6,000 square kilometers, perhaps more. Because 1,000 kilometers is the distance up to Aurangabad, and 400 kilometers more on this side. He knew exactly which routes to block. All this is happening at an age where there is no Google Maps, there are no satellite maps, nobody knows what India looks like. All you know is that there is one big landmass here to there is a river crossing here, there is a road here, there is a road there. He accurately judged which road to block, which point to go, and he cannot put armies everywhere. He needs to know exactly what point he needs to put an army of 10, 15,000 so as to effectively block Nasir Jang. So that is the beauty of the whole campaign, that Peshwa Bajirao, without the aid of any maps, manages to trap the Nizam over an area of thousands of square kilometers. And once Nasir Jang's entrapment is complete, it is a matter of time for the Nizam to surrender, because then Bajirao completely all the supply routes into Bhopal, and about 2-3 months later, the Nizam surrenders. As a result, the Maratha Empire expands by law under seal of the Nizam himself from the Narmada all the way to the Chambal.
So this is how almost entire North India comes into the sway of Hindavi Swarajya.
Yes.
Today's in modern terms, entire Gujarat, Maharashtra, all the Deccan, entire Deccan south of Narmada,
Right.
of course, plus MP, Berar, that is central India, Chhattisgarh area, Bengal area, and Agra and UP, western UP part. All
Right.
these territories sequentially are ceded to Maratha empires, to Hindavi Swarajya, so that the dream of Chhatrapati Shivaji is sequentially being met. So, and this thing I think is continued. This policy is continued by Bajirav's son, Nana Sahib the First, Balaji Bajirao Peshwe. And the defining moment of Balaji Bajirao's regime is, of course, the Punjab campaign, wherein I think after 800 years, a Hindu army went and liberated Punjab
Yeah.
from Islamic domination. When Raghunath Rao Peshwa made a dash to Peshawar itself, and threw out Pathans from the occupation of the original Sapta Sindhu, that
True.
which is the birthplace of our holy scriptures.
Sure, yes. So,
And
yes, go ahead.
basically, and of course, everybody knows about how it culminated. It culminated in Third Battle of Panipat. It was a temporary setback to the Hindvi Swarajya, and within matter of few years, almost entire territory which was lost was regained, and much more by the Hindvi Swarajya. And this comes to one of my favorite characters of Maratha history, the elder Madhav Rao Peshwa,
Right.
the 13, 14, 15-year-old prodigy on whom the prime ministership of entire India is thrust upon just after the defeat of Panipat, and how that boy in matter of 10 years manages to reclaim almost everything that was lost.
True.
And much more. And unfortunately died of TB at the age of 26, 27. That's very unfortunate. But the crowning glory of the young prince is Rakshas Bhuvan, wherein the Nizam is, I think, conclusively defeated. So Rakshas Bhuvan is the third trajectory point wherein we move to a higher orbit.
Yes.
Rakshas Bhuvan to Kharda, that particular point.
Yes. So, as you mentioned, the Battle of Panipat was a huge defeat for the Marathas, and not only in terms of men lost and the money lost in that campaign, but the Marathas also lose a very large chunk of their leadership potential. Is that Sadashirao Bhau gets killed on the battlefield. The first son of the Peshwa, Vishwas Rao, who is to succeed Nana Sahib, he is also killed on the same battlefield. We can also count Samsher Bahadur in the same link, who gets killed at Panipat. And a few months after the Panipat disaster, we find that the Peshwa Nana Sahib himself has passed away. So, in the year 1761, the entire top rung of the Peshwa dynasty has been wiped out, either by the battle or the effects of the battle. Now, Raghunath Rao obviously thinks at this point that he is the most senior person, but his campaigns have got a lot of depth. So, all the Maratha Sardars decide to put Madhav Rao in charge. He is the second son of the Peshwa, and at that point of time, he's only 16 years old. So, you can imagine the scenario in Pune that there is no Peshwa left. His brothers have died in the battle. Everybody is talking about how the Marathas have got finished at Panipat. The Peshwa is 16 years old, and the Nizam now thinks that this is a good time to invade and capture territory. So the Nizam, what he does is that his first attempt, in fact, is in collusion with Raghunath Rao. And this is the first point where Madhav Rao shows his leadership abilities. He finds that Raghunath Rao assembled himself at Ayegaon with some 70,000 troops. Madhav Rao has own 70,000 troops. And the Peshwa realizes that if this battle takes place at Ayegaon near Pune, where 150,000 Maratha soldiers are going to fight each other, it is going to end in complete disaster. Our sons are going to get killed. As it is, most of them got killed at Panipat few months before. Whatever remaining will get killed here. And the Nizam is waiting for his opportunity. He's going to take this entire kingdom in his hands. So Madhav Rao goes to Raghunath Rao Peshwa and he says that let us stop this battle. I am your junior. You please act like a elder brother to me. And this is where he shows his statesmanship and averts a major disaster. Obviously, Nizam isn't happy because he has lost his opportunity to govern Pune. He again attacks the next year. And while the Nizam attacks Pune directly, Madhav Rao Peshwa goes north the same way that Bajirao Peshwa had done. He goes north into Aurangabad and completely loots that city. Then he attacks the fort for one full month of Daulatabad. And the Nizam gets alarmed. Now he starts moving north. So Madhav Rao Peshwa comes south. Then he goes and loots Solapur. The Nizam then again heads towards Pune, but Madhura goes towards Hyderabad. And the Maratha armies reach Hyderabad, then they turn again towards Maharashtra. Now, what Madhura has done is that he has taken Janoji Bhosle with him of Nagpur, also the Chhatrapati of Kolhapur. With their help, he intends to dethrone the at Satara, who is Ram Raja at this point of time. And but Madhura Peshwa's intelligence network is so strong, he manages all these people defect from the Nizam, but he also ensures that they do not leave his army. And Madhurao then turns towards the Godavari, he starts coming back towards his own territories, and Nizam leaves Pune to tackle him on the Godavari somewhere. As he nears the town of Rakshas Bhumi, Nizam finds that all his soldiers, one by one, they've left him. So in August, he decides that he's going to turn north and go towards Aurangabad. At this point of time, Janoji Bhosle, he defects from the camp of the Nizam. He comes to Madhav Rao, and in fact, he sends a letter to Madhav Rao that the Nizam is headed north towards Aurangabad. Please increase your speed and catch him before he goes north. Otherwise, this will be a complete disaster for Madhav Rao if the Nizam is not defeated. Finally, what happens is that similar to the case where the lack of water defeated the Nizam, at Palkhed, here the Godavari is in flood in the month of August. On the 9th of August, near Rakshas Bhuvan, the Nizam crosses over with his artillery. Now only one general called Vitthal Sundar is left on the other side of the river. Nizam tells him that tomorrow you cross over because the artillery requires the best possible conditions of the river. Bit more of flooding, the soldiers can still cross. Madhura Peshwa finds out. He makes his army march in the middle of the night and catch this Vitthal Sundar who is camping on the banks of the Godavari at Rakshas Bhuvan waiting for sunrise to cross. So the Nizam finds a place where he is across the river is flooded, he has all his guns with him, which he can't fire, and he is generally standing there on the other side of the river facing the entire Maratha army. And in this battle, Madhavrao Peshwa shows his actual military skills and acumen and manages to score a stellar victory over the Nizam's general named Vitthal Sundar. Vitthal Sundar himself is killed by Sardar Shipoi Deshmukh, who beheads him. And the poor Nizam, all he can do is watch from the other end of the Godavari. His entire army gets decimated. About 9,000 people get killed and 4,000-6,000 more die while crossing the river. And this is a huge victory for Madhavrao Peshwa because not just a battlefield victory, but he also shows his diplomacy and negotiation skills and is really accepted as the Peshwa of the Marathas without any questions for the next 10 years, in which time he manages to defeat Hyder Ali 3 times in battle. And he also managed to send troops, over 70,000 troops to North India under one Kanade to assist Maharji Shinde in the annexation of Delhi post Panipat. So Madhavrao Peshwa dies at a very young age, but he dies with the knowledge that Delhi has been reconquered from the Afghans, and Maharashtra is also fully safe in the hands of the Marathas.
I mean, I think in Rakshas Bhuvan we also see the actual military prowess of young Madhavrao.
Yeah.
His cavalry charge and his spear throwing abilities are very well documented,
Yes.
especially on Vitthal Sundar. I think Vitthal Sundar is one of the 3 famous 3.5 wise men, which Maharashtrians derogatory call these people. And 3.5 is
so, yeah.
that's very catchy. So and the most important shift in this particular period after Punjab campaign, which you spoke of, is the departure from cavalry based warfare to artillery and infantry based warfare. The armies were beginning all over the world, not just in India, all over the world, to fight under the cover fire of artillery. I think Panipat was the first big attempt to move from traditional cavalry based warfare to have a drilled attack formation units wherein the cavalry goes and come back while the artillery is being reloaded. And since the technology is being updated very fast, When we see this also in First World War, that when technology speed is so fast that it's very difficult for nations to catch up the R&D जो हो रहा है. So
Yeah.
this is where we come to the final stage of Hindavi Swarajya, where they face off with Brits. The artillery and how the second Anglo-Maratha War, which actually by then when we say in the Maratha Empire, it had armies from Punjab, from Tamil Nadu, from Gujarat to Bengal. Basically, it was an Indian army of that time. So when we say Hindavi Swarajya army of post 1750s, we are talking about an Indian army. We had Telugu artillery chief and MP Malwa ka units and Gujarat ka units, Central India and Bengal ka units, Odisha ka units. All of them, in some way or the other, making the part of what Britishers called Maratha army, but what essentially was Indian army of that particular era, or a Hindu army of that particular era. So, and I think the
Yes.
gunmanship of Marathas is very well praised by even Arthur Wellesley, who went on to defeat Napoleon Bonaparte in Waterloo. I think he faced off with Marathas, and I think
Yes.
the battles with Marathas was the hardest battles of his entire career, which he rates above even Napoleon. Because the gunmanship of
Yes.
Maratha artillerymen was so accurate and so precise and so fast, so rapid, that they gave Brits extremely tough time all throughout battles of 1803 to 1802 to 1805, from Asai to Delhi to Patparganj to the last point of our talk, Battle of Laswari. In most of these battles,
Right.
some of the battles
So-
Marathas won, but even in the scenario of the loss, where Marathas or Hindus lost to Brits, again owing to superior technology, superior metallurgy, what material the artillery is made up of. That particular battle has some very interesting points which mark the end of one big era. So let's finish our talk while talking on
Yeah.
Battle of Laswari.
So, as I said before, that the artillery combination was what was really coming up in the world, because new developments have been made, especially the manufacturing of the quick loading musket had been invented. And this was a gun that could be handled by one person, and it could shoot a bullet that could kill an oncoming cavalry soldier. It was something that had not happened in the past before this. There had always been guns in existence, but what second point was that these guns were now mass produced. You could have a very number of people having guns. Earlier, when the muskets and the guns and bandukchis are talking about, these were small contingents. The kings and the rulers could afford to equip their entire army with these bandukchis. And plus, the accuracy of these guns was quite less. The muskets were more accurate compared, and had a very uh, good kill rate when they used in a war situation where it could be fired in a volley, where you could fire 50 or 60 of them at the same time, or at an oncoming cavalry charge. They could be absolutely devastating, because when you fire 60 bullets at 20 people coming at you, it's 100% sure all of them going to hit. So this then entailed a creation known as the infantry square, which Napoleon Bonaparte operated fully in his campaigns, especially against Egypt and also at Austerlitz.
Yes,
So
Austerlitz
this was
is the
1798,
defining moment.
1798.
Yes.
So in the Egypt campaign, we find that he employs his musketmen. They are arranged in 3 or 4 rows and into a rectangle. And in the hollow of this rectangle are placed all the supplies for the bullets, for the cavalry. All the leaders who are going to shout orders, going to direct the guns, they are all in the center of this. And the musketmen make a sort of chakravyu in 4 directions, where it's so this situation becomes very difficult. Like we mentioned about Mahabharata Chakravyu, it's very difficult to break this formation. And a person who manages to break it might cause casualties, but is sure to get killed in the process. And an unbroken infantry square in the hands of a general like Napoleon Bonaparte managed to have a kill rate of 60 or 70 people, maybe more, 400, 500 people killed for every one person that died on his side. So this was something that Sadashiv actually wanted to try out at Panipat. in a book by T.S. Shejawalkar, which I believe is one of the best books on Panipat, apart from a book called Sorceress at Panipat by Dr. Kulkarni. The book by Shri T.S. Shejawalkar makes a very good argument for this cavalry infantry tactic, in which Ibrahim Khan Gardi, as I mentioned, who was a Telugu, he arranged his troops with the heavy artillery front, supported by the musket men from behind, and artillery support from the sides. So the whole point was to blow apart the enemy with the artillery, and the cavalry would do mopping up operations. Unfortunately, the battle was lost, and more unfortunately, there was no critical examination as to why we lost. So we do not find, as of today at least, there is no document stating as to why they had a frank discussion regarding the tactics at Panipat, because only one instance is there where a possible discussion could have taken place. That is, Nana Peshwa summoned Mallara Holkar and Gaikwad to Pune to discuss the Panipat debacle. But before both of them could reach Pune, it was already the end of 1761 and Nana Peshwa had passed away. And then we had the whole fracas of Madhura already starting to happen. So a critical examination, a court martial of events of happened in Maratha history, we could not learn. And Sadashiv Rao Bhawan actually employed a tactic which would be world famous and copied by all armies 40 years later. So
He was sort of a visionary in that part. I mean,
so visionary in that part, but too visionary. I mean, nobody
too ahead
else
of its
in his
time.
army could perhaps
True.
too ahead of his time. Perhaps nobody else could comprehend at Panipat as to what is exactly happening here, because they did not have any precedents to go with. We have already won 5 battles like this. So at that point of time, all the battles were won by cavalry charges and skirmishes and harassment. But suddenly, one battle it was actually like sending a new opening partnership on a World Cup final. So it could have paid off, but did not pay off. But the greatest disaster was that we did not take up the point from there and start developing the artillery infantry.
But it did pay off subsequently.
The Marathas went back.
It did pay off subsequently. For example, when the initial Brit Wars happened, it paid off brilliantly. But in Laswari, it somehow didn't work out.
So it paid off in the sense that we did not take that thread and start developing from 1760s onwards. What happened was we went back to the cavalry charges of before, and it was only under Mahatma Shinde in 1780s and 1790s that this infantry artillery combination again started coming up, because Mahatma Shinde could see the advantages of this combination on the battlefield. And the problem what happened was that while Ibrahim Khan Gardi was a Telugu Muslim who fought for the Marathas right till the end, he could have at any point of time in that battle defected and gone to Abdali. But he kept fighting. He died on the battlefield of Panipat for the Marathas, in spite of knowing right from the afternoon that this is ended in dust. So that kind of nationalism was missing in the later day armies of the Maratha Empire of the 1790s. When I mention armies, I mean the leadership, because this leadership was entirely French. The one mistake the Marathas made in the 1790s was to not create an indigenous leadership for their army. Is that why they adopted
what we call officer officer cadre, the general staff. The general staff was French.
General staff. What you call the officer cadre. The people are going to strategize. People are going to direct the guns. People are going to make the large-scale maneuvers on the battlefield. Because the average soldier could be very good with his gun, but to handle 20 soldiers together is the job of a more seasoned officer. This is where they encountered General Jara, Allahabad, Agra, and Delhi, who had already fought in the American War of Independence, and who brought with him 30 years of experience to the warfare and schooling in England, all the top schools of that country. So this was the kind of general the Marathas were facing at Laswari. And General Gerard Lake says of their battle, there were 10,000 soldiers on either side. At the end of the battle of Laswari is a place near Alwar. It's an open ground where again we had an artillery infantry contest on both sides. Marathas were managing to win for some time, but then very similar to Panipat, General Gerard Lee pushed in his reserves, and the reserves uh, could not be coped with the Maratha army because their own maneuvers were not up to the mark. Because obviously, like I mentioned, their cadre had disappeared. And but General Gerard Lee says that the numbers equally matched, and that he was never in a contest as fiercely contested as that of Laswari battle. There was a Colonel Mallison who wrote a book on British military history 80 years later, and he says that the number of people contesting this battle and number of people who got killed in the battle, the ferocity with which it was fought, it is not matched anywhere in British Indian history. He's writing this in 1890, by which time British rule had been fully established in India. There's also Major Thorne who writes about the Battle of Laswari, and he says that such kind of battle has not taken place in Indian history. So we find that at Laswari, about 10-15,000 Maratha soldiers were literally fighting for Swarajya to be re-established in the face of British opposition, and for some tactical errors, and we were not really following the ideals of Chhatrapati Shivaji. What had happened was that over the course of the past 100 years, the ideals that had been put forth by Chhatrapati Shivaji in making his kingdom were not really there for the successors. So these foreign mercenaries and giving up the land to various jagirdars, all these things would not have happened if Chhatrapati Shivaji had existed. But over a course of time, various problems had crept in, and the loss at Laswari was, of course, a very brave fight, but the loss was a reason, was a cause of moving away from these principles.
There is one more reason is about the technology gap. The amount of engineering which had been evolving in Europe, that was a main factor which we didn't have that particular backdrop. And I think the ideal lived on in
Yes.
1857 when Marathas under Nana Sahib II, Tatya Tope, Jhansi Ki Rani, they all rose again for the same ideal of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj to re-establish Hindvi Swaraj all across India. So that kind of says ki the vision or the dream of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj to establish, the very epithets of Shivaji Maharaj, Go Brahmana Pratipalak, Kshatriya Kulavatamsa, Sinhasanadhishwar, all these the classical the metaphors invoking classical Hindu emotions which directly connect to normal ordinary Hindus like us has been, even if dormant were alive until as late as 1857 or maybe as late as the death of Sri Lokmanya Tilak, which shows the thread of continuity of Hindu resistance for self-determination of this India.
Yes. So I take it one by one. So first is that about technology and engineering. Like at Laswari, I mentioned, become the Indian Army. So at the Battle of Laswari, people who were ethnically Maharashtrians were about 2 or 3,000 fighting under one Gulab Beg Khan. The remaining army was of majority Purbiyas, that is of Bihar and UP region. And a lot of the soldiers were ethnically Jats, Rajputs, and even some Dakkani Muslims and other Muslims. So basically, this is what, And coming to engineering, it is so false that Marathas did not have an idea as to what was happening elsewhere, because you find that even orders for watches were given by the Peshwas. So obviously, if you are aware of all European watches, they would be well aware of the technology development taking place. Where they faltered was in not having an efficient manufacturing department which could match with those European counterparts.
So I think
faltered. The falteration happened at the numbers end, where they kept being dependent on the British, Portuguese, French for supplying their arms. And the British, just to cite one example, when Madhavrao Peshwa asked for some 15 or 20,000 cannonballs to be given, they supplied some 5,000, some figures like that. So the British were very well aware as to how to leverage their influence in terms of arms and the arms race. Something I think we have not yet learned in 2020 also.
Perfect. So I think, Anish, we are running out of time.
Yes.
So please watch out for Anish Gokhale. His book Battles of the Maratha Empire is to be released very soon. Due to lockdown, the print edition will be a bit delayed, but the Kindle edition will be released very soon. And please watch out for the book. It's awesome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
With these words, I say namaskar. It was wonderful as usual talking to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Jai Shri Ram.